Well, okay, thanks.
My question's for William. So you spoke about the standardisation of artillery munitions, which is fantastic. We're very lucky that happened. To what extent, from a broader perspective, to what extent do you think that the standardisation of artillery munitions had an effect on the domestic workforces and manufacturing processes on the home front? And what benefits did that have in the whole of government and a national strategic sense?
Well, it had, to begin with, it really helped David Lloyd George get to where he was going. He was the Minister for Munitions and was part of that standardisation and the growth expansion of the munitions industry that had to go on. So there's a big expansion in skilled work, and a lot of it is, as we know, done by women. So I guess it leads into a lot of problems later on societally, but it leads... The sudden expansion was what initially led to the poor quality of shells, because they were just chucking out as much as they could. And during the song, there are accounts of people seeing things that they thought were mushrooms growing in the field, and they got closer and it was duds. As much as 60% were duds of this artillery just failed to go off. Half of it went off in the barrel and blew up guns. They took guns out of the equation. It was a disaster, so they had to bring in some kind of quality control, and so the process leads to things like standardisation in factory. With the Colt gun manufacturer and all the parts being interchanged, that is writ large in Britain, in British industry. And suddenly they are working on creating things where you can interchange parts, you can interchange machines, and everything is for streamlining an industry and building. So it's critical, and the success of that program is what leads to the rise of David Lloyd George as well. So that's a good thing and a bad thing, I think.
My question's maybe to Paul Stevens and really the panel entirety in its entirety. With the very minutely planned advance, was there any opportunities for company commanders or battalion commanders to take advantage of any opportunities that they might see? And how was opportunity targets, or how were opportunity targets communicated back to higher formation headquarters? If something was observed out in the field on the advance, how would that rapidly be communicated back to the headquarters?
Under a barrage, as Malia said, once the barrage is firing, there's very little opportunity to modify it. So the whole aim of the creeping barrage was to just creep slowly across the countryside, neutralising everything in its path. And so that opportunity did not arise when there's a creeping barrage around. When mobile warfare started, then the only way that they could deal with that was to send gun sections to accompany the forward infantry. And interestingly enough, on the morning of the 8th, in between the advance to the green and red line, if you read the artillery brigade war diaries, the purpose of these gun sections was only incidentally to support the infantry. What they were sent there for was to knock out anti-tank guns, but they did both jobs. It sounds good. The writing suggests that it was a bit more difficult than you think it is, because the guns are not right up in the front line, obviously. They're a couple of hundred metres behind. Then there's only a section, so not every company commander is going to be near the section. What they tried to do, though, was to send forward observers with the infantry and liaison officers at battalion headquarters. And they kept an overwatch. The real control of fire, it seems to me, was overwatch, I'll call them that, they didn't call them that, but overwatch observation posts, watching the people advance in front, seeing targets arise, in communications with the guns, dealing with them that way. So it was it was a far less sophisticated method than we have now. Before they invented tactical radio, they were in real strife.
I would just add in the field as well in 1918, there's a reason why a lot of Victoria Crosses, particularly the Australian Corps, are individuals rushing strong posts because that's their only option. Nobody's asking for permission to undertake that. If something's holding up an advance, it's individual initiative that deals with it, either like the nutter with a machine gun or like the platoon commander who sends his bombing section around and or sends his Lewis guns to a different area, or, you know, like they've got to deal with it on the spot, or they've got to hold up everything. And with this semi-mobile warfare that's going on, the infantry and you know, particularly professional capable infantry like the Australians are able to deal with it in the immediacy.
Yeah, communications is a big issue for all the arms because there was no air-to-air radios. A radio, even by the middle of 1918, weighed several hundred pounds, so you either had an observer or a radio. You couldn't have both generally. Even the smaller ones were still just coming in. So what would happen was you would, as an airman, you would be given a very specific part of that grid, which I showed you, to fly around and monitor. So you wouldn't stray out into another area because some other aircraft was tasked with that. And if you found battery fire, one of the things you could do was scratch a note, put the code on it, and they used those tins of film spools with a streamer on. They'd throw it out over the friendly forces. That would then get to the battery commander and they'd do the counter battery fire. The problem with that is it all takes time. And so consequently, if the Germans had a mobile battery, by the time the message got back to your battery, you were probably hitting an empty paddock. So communications was an issue for all elements.
And sorry, just to follow that up, there was an incident, a way of reacting quickly to German batteries firing from aircraft. They had a radios in them, and the field artillery brigades mostly had a receiver, and the heavy artillery brigades had a receiver. And batteries were told off to provide immediate response once they got a call. Those batteries would be what we now call superimposed on any fire plan. They'd be firing in it, but they could be taken off without harm. So there was a means of quite rapidly reacting to that done by those early radios.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the talks. Graham Sligo, just a question about training and education. It occurs to me that from 1916 to 1918 there's been huge advances in the human element and the training and education that must have occurred to bring people to the quality that they're at by 1918. So what's occurring back in the home base at the Lark Hill equivalents, and what's occurring within the five armies in France in the training and doctrine type loop over that 2-year period, please?
It's a good question, and there is a constant effort to learn. The early years of the war are suffused with just like, it's almost a panic. It's not a panic. I mean, they're not panicking, but there is a sudden flurry of ideas and they urgently need to be gotten out. And corps commanders talk to each other and they have ideas and they send messages to everybody else. And the British Army takes control of that and says, right, you can't send lessons learnt out to people unless we approve them. So they streamline the system. Training takes place, you know, as it always does, but with more specialist training. And they start, you know, small at platoon, like individual training, then platoon training, and then build up to these big practice operations with divisions and trying to incorporate as much of what they're going to see as possible, live ammunition and all, you know, all sorts of things. What's really important in the development of the infantry and their professionalism is the amount that they are allowed to know about the operations. So they see maps. They're given a pretty good idea at least of what their company should be doing, if not the companies on their flanks, at a bare minimum. But, you know, by 1917, we're seeing like the mock-up on the ground so that they can see it, they can see what the hill looks like, they can see where they're going. And that sort of education and trust in the lower levels of command means that if your platoon sergeant gets knocked, someone is there to take over, and that works all the way up the line and is very effective.
And at least one of the British armies had an artillery school from our perspective. So its artillery commander would send the artillery personnel allocated to his army off to school to learn lessons. What lessons? Well, the advent of predicted fire. How do you predict fire? How do you use, by Hamel and by the 8th of August, the survey companies are coming along giving each battery what they call an artillery board. They've plotted the battery centre on a board, which is then gridded up for the battery to mark the targets on. So these are all advances that happened during the war, and people have to be trained in how to use them. And that mechanism was certainly there.
Yeah, a good example is the Australian Airman training scheme that very quickly became quite important. We had more aircraft and more airmen in England during the war than we did in France. We had 3 squadrons deployed at the height of the battle at this time frame into France and the Western Front. But back in England, we had 4 training squadrons, a maintenance depot, a training depot for ground crew, and a liaison office in London as well. And the reason was because they knew that when we sent these young guys over to fly against the Germans and whatnot, they needed to have more than just a few hours flying. Part of that training depended on what sort of squadron you were going to. If you were going to go to a fighter squadron, you went to Gosport to do the School of Aerial Fighting course, where guys that had been there, done that, come back as aces, taught the young kids air combat tactics. Maybe they didn't get very many hours, but at least they had the basics. If you were going to a bomber unit, you practiced bombing runs with a night or day. And if you were a corps squadron, you learnt that zone call system in your sleep. Because as soon as you got to the front, there's no more time for training, you're straight into it. And that was a good decision the Australian High Command made, spending the effort and getting it done. One of the most dangerous jobs in the Airman Corps was to go back as an instructor, because generally speaking, the students tried to kill you. And more of them died in air crashes and collisions than they did over the front lines. Sad but true.
Dr. Mark Lax, I'm just curious, what were the with the advent of aircraft flying around for artillery observation, then obviously artillery shells flying through the air, did they develop any ways to manage airspace deconfliction?
Not at that time, no. It was see and be seen pretty much. It became more and more of a problem, as I mentioned, when you've got a condensed area, such as the battlefront of Amiens. You've got aircraft at high level, they're the fighters looking for enemy fighters. You've got the bombers doing their bombing missions at medium level, and you've got your corps squadrons in and out supporting the troops. The observer did several things. Took notes, did maps, shot at enemy, looked out for the pilot. And that was important because number of mid-air collisions, I think you've seen the show in the War Memorial. That's indicative of late 1918, most of that. You know, the massed German fighter squadrons, the Richthofen sort of stuff. They didn't come in until quite late in the war. But essentially, you're right, there was no air traffic control, it was see and be seen. Not too much instrument flying either, by the way. So if you went into cloud, someone else could be there.
Thank you very much for today. My question is from General Paul Stevens. Sir, you mentioned the fire plans and the firepower evident in the Battle of Hamel and the following offensive. My question is, what was the pressure put on the CSS nodes and unsung hero at the back, providing artillery with its rounds and all the stores and equipment? What was the pressure on that? And for all those brigades, how many assets were dedicated for the resupply?
Off the top of my head, I don't know, but the there was, in the lead up to the battle, the effort was prodigious. And they had to bring in lots of artillery brigades. They all came with their tail with them, but there was also, they had to then bring all the ammunition to them. So I don't know off the top of my head, but they spent a lot of time getting that right, and had to do it in secret as well, which was even more difficult, because they would only put things in the field in the night, then they'd camouflage them, and then you had to dump the ammunition next to them without it being seen. So it was a huge, huge logistic problem. And I didn't spend, unfortunately, much time looking at that, except to know it's a problem. When the advance began, the problem then changed. The problem then became, how do you move this ammunition forward? And the Australian Corps implemented a system whereby they'd bring ammunition up, and when the battery moved on, it would leave that ammunition behind, and the ammunition train would come and pick it up and move it forward again. So it became a little bit of a roll thing behind the troops. But even so, and they don't seem at any one point where they needed fire support, they don't seem to have been lacking in a number of rounds for the task at hand. So whatever they did, and it's probably worth a study all of its own, isn't it, if you're a logistician, as to how they did it. I did read the 4th Army's after action, the 4th Army Artillery Commander's after action report on the Battle of Hamel. And he was in that particularly complimentary of the system that the Australian Corps managed to put in place. But what that system was, I'm afraid I can't answer tonight.
Thanks, mate. By the way, James, Army Headquarters. Sorry for not doing that last time. I've got more of a social observation-based question for you, Ellen, rather than a historical observation. Back at Sydney University, when you were speaking with your colleagues and other people you work with around the university, to what extent do they have an affinity or a natural personal affinity or ownership of the Anzacs of the First World War? And do you feel they have the same affinity with the modern Australian Army?
Well, at Sydney University, technically, I'm part of the museum section. So they have a very broad-ranging idea on general topics throughout museums rather than Anzacs. But as far as I can tell, most people accordingly are critical of the Anzacs and the whole idea on Anzac. They don't just accustom themselves and going, yes, this is the legacy, but usually those people are also war historians who have completed their undergrad and gone through. So my colleagues are the people who are war historians, are a bit more critical of it, whereas those who, say, for example, we have many people who did ancient history-based undergraduates, very different approach. People who did science degrees, also very different approach. So at the University of Sydney, it's very broad-ranging, and it's very interesting to see the different ideas depending on people's backgrounds. At the University of Wollongong, however, seeing as that's where I did my main focus on war history, people are very critical in the history department in making sure that there is a balance. It's like they recognise that there is an importance to that type of memory and that type of identity, but that it is important to reflect on this in order to move forward, so that there is different ideas and that one narrative doesn't become the overarching narrative for everyone's experiences.
And their relationship with modern Australian Army?
Their relationship, as far as I know, they say they have had some ad hoc conversations with people. With the current Australian Army, they believe there are some elements that are drawn upon, so that they go, yes, for example, like mateship and encouraging everyone to be courageous and belong together, but there are some elements where things get distorted, and they need to make sure that they are very encouraging in saying that it needs to be put in a modern perspective by the historians so that it can be applied to the modern army. But as far as I know, there is no direct line that's critically analysing between, or critical opinion between, the idea of the Anzac and the modern army.
David Goyne, General Stevens, I'll ask you this as a modern day train gunner, and you're looking back at the fire plans of this time, and it's based on 4 years of learning, but is there anything that strikes you as peculiar about what they did? I mean, like, we don't teach a creeping barrage or anything like that now. It'd be more like that ad hoc targets type of approach to it. I'm wondering if there's anything that surprised you about what they did.
That's a good question. Look, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, they start the war, as Malia said, thinking we're going to be mobile operations, we'll have direct fire. But even before the war, they knew that was hardly going to last. There's all sorts of contradictions in the doctrine. That they had doctrine, but there were contradictions in it. They could see the change coming. It's not surprising to me that once you stop having mobile warfare and you start getting into static warfare, then it's the job of the artillery. The British always said the job of the artillery is to prepare the way for the infantry. It's not actually to win the war by themselves. It's actually to prepare the way for the infantry. So someone's got to knock down the defences. Someone's got to allow the infantry to get in. So it's really not surprising that you go through a phase of thinking that you've got to destroy things and you've got to use the artillery to destroy it, which it's actually not particularly suited for. It takes a long time, lots of ammunition, disrupts the topography and does all sorts of things like that. So it's not surprising that they go through that phase. Then they think, but hang on a minute, we don't necessarily have to do that. If you can keep his head down until you're on top of him, then you can help the infantry in and you can fight. So now we go to suppression, and that's the phase of basically the phase of the creeping barrage. And the creeping barrage is there because you've got to suppress the whole landscape. You can't just suppress this target and that target because the Germans have learnt to put the machine guns in between the targets. So you've got to have, you try and suppress the whole lot. And all the German army did exactly the same. They had the same big debates about destruction, and the German army was very critical of the French because the French insisted on having long barrages before attacks, right up until 1918. And all the Germans said is, we know where you're coming because this is, you're just bombarding all of this. No surprise here. Surprise became a factor. For the British then, two things occur. One is you get tanks. So you actually don't need the artillery now to blast holes in the wire. Tank will do that for you. You don't need the artillery to do close support, in a sense, because the tanks will do that for you. And the other one is, as Malia pointed out, the infantry become far more capable within their own capacity. So they are now able to manoeuvre between parts of a barrage falling. And that's what we saw on Mont Saint-Quentin when the divisional artillery started applying concentrations on various targets, leaving the spaces in between with nothing in them, which meant that the infantry had to overcome those spaces if anything occurred there. But they were capable now of doing it because they had semi-automatic weapons, they had mortars, they had that other capacity. So it's a long-winded answer to your question. I think in my mind I can see the way the processes of trying to support the infantry developed, and you can't really fault what happened. All armies, in fact, used very similar techniques. So it must have been a technique that worked for that war at that time. A bigger question might be, well, did we hang on to these techniques too long and try to apply them in the next war when it wasn't so apposite?
A little bit, like, just a reminder from the Mons and Contan business. Yeah. Oh, nobody's ever called me softly spoken before. That is so exciting. Sorry, artilleryman, I'm on it. Okay. With the firepower and the overarching firepower, one of the really important lessons from Mons and Contan is like some of those gaps I suspect you'll find are caused by the slope in the hill and some problems filling all of the space. And the infantry know they need their overarching firepower, so they fill it in themselves, particularly through the use of rifle grenades at that point. They fire their own impromptu creeping barrage using their own at-hand material to do the same sort of job. And that points back to the competence of the infantry question. They are so professional, they know how warfare works, they're encouraged to talk to each other about how warfare works, and they can fill in the gaps when they need to on the fly.
Questions?
Thank you.
Good evening. This question is to the whole panel. To what extent do you believe that, rather than the issue that you raised, Dr. Leah, about essentially good ideas being stifled, what do you think about the assertion that it was actually that lessons were learned too sporadically? Even at the end of the Boer War, we had very similar ideas being applied in 1918, when really, ideally, we would have applied them in 1914.
This is my particular point of interest, actually, is learning on the Western Front and how it happens. And the problem is that warfare is epically complicated at this point in time. So even, like, if you look at the 1918 battles, they are colossally epically complicated. Like, there's all sorts of different things have to work in concert and in certain ways. But even in your relatively straightforward battles where they are trying to apply a rudimentary lifting barrage and they've got infantry moving across a battlefield, heaps of different things can go wrong. And so they'll come out of an attack at Pozières, for example, or any of the year before, and they might say, well, that sort of succeeded, so maybe it was because we did it at night, or maybe it was because the barrage was right, and they pick one thing and they sort of hang all their hopes on the time of the attack or the amount of smoke used or the gas or the terrain, and then they harp on that one for a long time, and it's easy to then miss other lessons or other factors. And so because it's so complicated, you find, for example, if you look at the artillery, their learning curve is really smooth. Like, they go from technological strength to strength. They know what they need to do, but then the capability of that arm is put into an army or a corps commander, and it might not be applied correctly in the battle plans. And then your tanks get blamed or something else gets blamed. And so the process is just complicated and ongoing and easy to pick the wrong thing, I think.
I also think there's an experience question here, that you start the war with a well-trained cadre, essentially, this war, and then you expand your army n-fold. And you can't stop fighting, you must keep fighting. People have got to learn lessons. And so there's a time that it takes for those people to become experienced people, to understand what the lesson actually is. So some mistakes will be made out of naivety, some mistakes will be made out of wrong application, good try, fail. So it takes time, but it is interesting to see in the BEF, as Malia mentioned before, that after a while they started to collect lessons learnt. They started to publish pamphlets. There's a whole list of them. There's 196 or something of them. And they're fascinating to read. You can find them on the net and you can read them, you know. Artillery in the attack 1915, artillery in the attack 1916, artillery in the attack 1917. You can see the lessons that have been learnt in the past coming through. And so, where am I going with this? I think there was a system to capture lessons, but it has to be populated by people who are at the same time gaining the experience to work through that process and understand what the lessons were.
Yeah, just on that, the artillery spotting guide, if you want to call it, pamphlet, started in 1915-16, it was 4 pages. By the time of Hamel, it was 32 pages. That zone system had been expanded exponentially in its detail and how, exactly where on the code you plotted it and so forth. So to become an observer, you had to get through all of that stuff as well as your normal airman training. I'd also wanted to point something else out to you. There's the changing culture here of the airmen and the guys on the ground. The airmen are all army officers, majority of them. A lot of them had been commissioned from the ranks, but by the time of 1918 comes along, they're starting to get that airman approach to the world as opposed to the ground approach. Now, I don't mean that in any offensive way, but for example, the airmen would go and do their thing. They would live for 90 minutes of sheer terror in the air, but they'd land at an airfield way back from the front, so they weren't within artillery range, they weren't within enemy infantry charge range, they knew they were safe. Generally speaking, they had a mess. The guys in the trenches never had a mess. Generally speaking, they had a tent and a stretcher, a nice pillow to sleep on. Guys in the trenches didn't. This then is the start of the difference in cultures between the various elements in the army. Then, of course, you get an Air Force in a few years' time and it changes again. But it's an interesting observation.
Can I just say something about culture on the way through?
You're going to be here all night.
No, and take it. I want to take it from the German experience. The fellow who is famous for developing German artillery tactics is Bruckmüller. He's an Eastern Front artillerist. An Eastern Front artillerist. He develops all his ideas on the Eastern Front. The guys on the Western Front think, that's fine over there, but it's never going to work here. So he's got a cultural issue of trying to convince them, and he's working against the culture of the German army, which is to place the resources in the hands of the divisional commander. And so, if you read his book, he bangs on about the need for centralisation of the artillery planning and how long it took to convince the army that this was a good thing. When the British were going through the same thing, but they didn't have the same issues because the culture of the BEF was slightly different.
All I was going to say, because don't mind me, that's fine. In relation to your question, to even see the immediate changes between 2 battles, if you use Hamel and Amiens as the 2 case studies, is even at Hamel, one of the biggest issues that was debated over and over was the timing. Some were saying it's too dark. It came from everyone's different opinions, whether it was Air Force, artillery, everyone had a different opinion on when it should start. Initially, it was thought dawn. Dawn was going to be the best, but then that would alert the Germans to the approach. They could see them. It was also an issue. They realised that the smoke on the day from the shells, because it was so dry in Hamel, actually caused more visual issues than they actually intended and thought was possible. So combine that with the darkness. But as you heard earlier from Amiens, they changed the timing. They started it later, and yet it was still too dark. So they obviously would make minor changes at battle to battle. And after the Battle of Hamel, they published a pamphlet. They took it all into consideration as to be expected with the hundreds that they published afterwards. But it would take so much longer to encourage people to make that change. It could be an hour, but because they weren't convinced. They might change 1 hour and think it doesn't make a difference, but obviously it does.
One and all, I'm going to have to stop the questions there, but thank you for those. I'm going to ask you to show your appreciation for our speakers tonight, one at a time, as I'm able to present them with a small memento of their efforts tonight. Ellen. Belia. Paul. And of course to Mark.
And ladies and gentlemen, can I keep the applause going one more time for Professor Craig Stockings, our MC for the night.